Hello, my name is Tony Reed. I'm a physician. I also work as a medical editor for Médecins Sans Frontières, and I'm going to be talking about publishing without perishing. Since I was a medical editor of a scientific journal for a number of years, I have the magic bullet into how to get published, and I'm going to share some of the secrets of getting published with you. So you're not alone in having to deal with an editor. You'll see that even God has to deal with an editor. This is a cartoon of Moses who's talking to God and says, okay, I agree these 100 commandments clarifying your point of view, but I'm going to have circulation problems, not to mention the public's short attention span, so we'll have to condense them way down. All right, if you can take nothing away from this presentation other than these golden rules, please look at these. Before you write the article, go and choose the journal that you want to use. This is extremely important because you'll be able to write the article exactly the way the journal wants you to do it. Many people write an article first, a rough draft, and then they change it to fit the journal's guidelines. But why do that? Why not do it the way the journal says so in the first place? So I tell you, choose your journal, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Choose your journal before you start writing. Go and print off the journal's guidelines. And every journal's website has a section on author's guidelines. And then you print them off, put them up where you tend to do your actual writing, and just follow the guidelines. It's easy. That's the roadmap to how to get published. So how do you choose a journal for publication? The number one thing is to look for your audience. Who do you want to read this article? Who would be interested in it? That's the most important thing. Don't look at the prestige of the journal necessarily, but look at who's going to read it and how they will use it. You next then have to look at the interests of the journal. Some are general medical journals like BMJ, Lancet, New England Journal. They cover a wide range of topics, or PLOS One is another good one. Some are very specific. You can have a journal on obstetrics and gynecology, or the International Journal of TB and Lung Disease, obviously deals with TB and lung disease. The third criterion is whether or not it's listed in PubMed. You want your article to be read and found by other readers, and most people go to PubMed first to look at what they're going to be searching for. So make sure the journal's on PubMed. Most peer-reviewed journals are on PubMed, but just be sure before you start. Impact factor. My advice on impact factor is to forget it. It's an artificial figure calculated to give some sense of the weight of a journal, but in fact it's somewhat artificial and can be manipulated by editors. Really ignore the impact factor. Another criterion is turnaround time. We've had experience with a few journals that are extremely slow in getting back the first review, and then subsequent revisions they're also very slow. This is very discouraging and takes a lot of your time wasted while you wait for journals to get back their reviews. So if you have an experienced mentor, speak to them about whether or not their turnaround time experience has been reasonable or not. There's now a big divide between open access journals and closed journals. In the past, closed journals did not charge the author for publishing, but they charged readers. Then in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a number of new journals started up where the author pays for publication and readers can read for free. In the recent times, quite a few of the closed journals offer an open access option where you pay up front to have your article read for free. And I suggest that you use that because people who are reading these kind of articles tend to have limited financial resources and you want them to be able to access them easily. So I would strongly advise going for either an open access journal or the open access option on a closed journal. The journal website will tell you. And finally, my final criterion is to ask a mentor, someone who's experienced in the field, which journal to choose, or a librarian. They're often very knowledgeable about what type of journal your subject may fit best. So choose the journal before you start writing, and these are the criteria. You then go to the journal's website. It will tell you the types of articles that they tend to publish and what kind of subjects they look at. You can see here there's a list. Most of your articles that you want to be publishing will be original research, But often if your topic is of somewhat limited scope, i.e. a small sample, or just a single site, you may want to write a short report. This is no less valid scientifically. It just means that you make your point in fewer words. And I can tell you from an editor's point of view, it's often better to have a short report that's crisp and clear and gets to the point rather than having a long article about the same thing. In the past, editors were very concerned about word count because they had print journals that only had a certain number of pages, and so a short report would be seen more favorably than a long article to make the same scientific points. However, more recently with open access and online journals, this is less of an issue. However, I can tell you that as an editor, you can pretty well tell that certain types of articles are best suited for short reports, and if you craft your article as a short report, then you have a better chance of getting accepted. The standard length of a short report is 1,200 to 1,500 words, whereas a full article can be 2,500 to 3,500 words, or sometimes more, just so you know. Case reports are pretty self-explanatory. Often there are a section in each journal for opinion pieces or editorials. And finally, quite a few people write short letters to the editor that make a small scientific point. This is possible, but not really the kind of article you're going to be writing. As I mentioned, each journal has guidelines on how to write the article, and these include everything from types of articles, the length, the formatting, how to do references, and so on. It's extremely important that you follow those journal guidelines very carefully. I can tell you that the editor will tell immediately whether or not you've followed their guidelines, and if you haven't, they'll often think, well, this person's not really serious enough about our journal, why bother publishing? So do it right the first time. Finally, if you're not sure whether your article fits or your article doesn't quite meet the guidelines, you might write to the journal editor and say, we have this kind of article, we think the subject is of interest to your readers, how would you suggest we frame it? And I've done this on a couple of occasions as an author, written to an editor, and I've got back a positive reply. So that's another way of approaching that. All right, now let's move on to the different sections of the article. Virtually all scientific articles are structured in this way. It's called the IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Results, Discussion, plus or minus Conclusion. We'll talk about the introduction here. The introduction should be, in a typical 2,500 word to 3,500 word article, should be approximately 2 pages double-spaced, no more than that. It does not need to be a complete literature review. You should start off with what the general problem is in about 1 sentence, then quickly move to the specific question being addressed. At this point, you need to have done your research and make sure you know exactly what's going on in that particular field. You have to show in 2 or 3 sentences that you know what the up-to-date evidence is, and most important, what the evidence does not tell you. What are the gaps in knowledge? What are the problems with previous research? And really what the editor is looking for is, what is your article going to fill in that isn't already known? Don't oversight previous references. If you say HIV is a serious health problem, references 1 to 35, the editor will know you haven't read all 35 articles. You just want to cite 1 or 2 that are the most recent and most relevant to your point. Having found out having discovered or having shown what you think is the gap in the literature that your particular study can fill, you should market that, because I, as the editor, at the end of the introduction, want to know what's new. What is going to be the contribution of this article to the world literature? Editors do not want to publish something that's just redundant and is the same old, same old. So please be very important. It's very important that you focus on what's new here. Finally, you want to conclude the introduction with a 1 or 2 sentence summary of what your objectives are. And you can spell them out. The objectives of the study are 1, da-da, 2, da-da, 3, da-da. It's very important that you need to have them spelled out at the beginning. If you don't know what your objectives are at the beginning, then the rest of the article will probably be a mess. And most important, when I come to the conclusion of the article, I'll go back to the aims and objectives to see whether in fact you answered them. In the methods section, there's a specific structure, and I would follow that. I would suggest that you actually use these headings and under each one fill in the necessary information. The first one would be the design. If this is a descriptive study using routinely collected data, you should say so. If it's a randomized controlled trial, if it's a qualitative study, you just have to state that. The second section is setting, and this should be divided into two sections. The general setting would be the country where you're doing your research, and give some background as to the type of socioeconomic background of the people that you're studying, the health indicators, and so on. Then you want a more specific setting of actually where this study took place. If in fact you're describing a new program, for instance, an HIV program or a TB program, you'll want to have specific details in this section about how your program works. A reader will want to read, how do you manage HIV, or how do you manage non-communicable diseases in a slum setting, for instance. So detailed explanation of what actually goes on in your program should be in this section on setting. The next section is sample population. You need to have inclusion and exclusion criteria explicitly spelled out. The next section will be on how you collect the data, where you're getting it from, how is it validated, and specifically you will need to list the variables that you're going to be collecting, how they're defined, where you're going to get them, and whether or not they've been validated. If, for instance, you're doing a study that requires a survey, you might want to describe that you piloted the survey in a certain subsection of the population. Similarly, if you're doing qualitative research, you may well want to talk about a pilot study of several small focus groups before you actually start the study. I think the analysis strategy should come at this section where you have sample size included in the statistical tools you're going to be using. An editor really doesn't care whether you're using SSPS or Stata. What the editor wants to know is whether the statistical test you've chosen is appropriate for the kinds of measurement you're doing. So it's really important to say, if you're using chi-squared, t-tests, or whatever, to explain why you're using those. At this same section, I think sample size should be spelled out in detail. At this point, you've already defined the sample population and your variables, and it makes sense to put sample size calculation here. Some protocols I've seen have put sample size in earlier, but this doesn't make sense to me. Finally, at the end of the methods section, you need to have details about how ethics approval was obtained. In most cases, ethics approval must be obtained both in the country of the study itself, and if it's being run by a more developed country institution, that ethics from that institution will also have to be included. The next section of your article is results. This should include just the facts, but nothing but the facts. And the facts should be listed in the order of your objectives. So in other words, if you have 3 objectives, list your results in the same order. It's very important that you keep the same pattern. The first part of the results, you'll include a response rate. This is the proportion of patients you actually interviewed from your sample. The next part will include a description of your sample, and this is the demographics. You'll have a short description in the text and then a table with age, sex, and so on, socioeconomic status, and probably some figures reflecting the type of disease you're studying, CD4 count, TB stage, something like that. This gives an overall profile of your particular sample. It's important that you don't include all the results of the table in the text. The text and tables should be separate, and the table should stand alone. You should be able to look at a table and see from the title and the footnotes how to interpret the table. and the text should only be used to highlight the important take-home points from the table or figure. After the demographics, you'll want to include your outcomes, and this will again be depending on the order of your particular objectives. You'll want to have the numbers, percentages. P-values are useful, of course, if you're comparing things, but just as important are confidence intervals. A wide confidence interval indicates you've got a pretty small sample size, and similarly, you can have very small confidence intervals indicating a large sample size, and that's important for the reader to see. I've mentioned avoiding duplication between the text and the tables, and that they should be able to be standing alone. A lot of people take their results and rake them back and forth and sideways for different cross-tabulations to try to find something statistically significant. That's really not fair. You should only be using statistics to indicate whether or not the objectives you set out to demonstrate were statistically significant or not. Only report your planned outcomes. Finally, the last section of your article will be the discussion, and this is where you want to make something of your results. I like to start off with a sentence or two indicating the main findings of your study, linking back to your objectives so that it pulls the study all together. Next, you should go on to describe what's new and why it's important. This is what you're trying to market to the readers. A section then would be indicated on the strength of the study, for instance, a large sample size, or that you studied a group that had not been studied before, say females when only males had been studied before. You want to highlight in this section what's new. At the same time, you'll want to compare your results to the literature. You may have mentioned some studies in the introduction that are important, and you may want to describe then how your study is similar to theirs, and in many cases it'll be different. At that point, you will want to describe why you think your study results are different from those already in the literature. It may be because you have a different sample size, larger for instance, or you've sampled a different group of people, or you have a different kind of program that addresses problems with previous studies. You're allowed some speculation as to why yours is different than other studies, but it must be reasonable. As an operational research study, it's really important that you have a section on what are the clinical and programmatic implications of your study. How will it matter? Operational research focuses on questions that are developed in a program, and the study should answer those programs, as well as then indicating changes in policy, either at the program level, the national level, or even the international level. There's usually new questions raised in any study that you'll have to address, and you might want to mention them specifically in future studies, but the throwaway line that future study is indicated seems to me just a waste of words. Finally, you should end up with your discussion with a discussion of limitations. Every study has some compromises. You'll have to explain that maybe this was a descriptive study based on routinely collected data. It's not always 100% reliable. There may be gaps in the literature. You may have a smaller sample size than you expected. You may have a lower response rate. It's important in limitations to not only address them, but explain why you think they happened in the first place and what compensatory mechanisms you included in your study to try to minimize their effects. The study should wrap up with a conclusion. Some journals will have a separate section on conclusion, whereas other journals just leave it to the end of the discussion. If it's in the latter category, make sure you have a separate paragraph that does wrap things up. Keep the conclusion short and simple, 2 to 3 sentences maximum. Summarize what you've found, but be sure it's based on your data. If you've only sampled a single province in a country, don't extrapolate to say that your findings can be generalized to the whole country or a whole region. Keep it very focused on what you actually found. And it must relate back to your objectives. Extremely important. As an editor, I've seen many articles where the conclusion was far away from the adjectives. All right, now I'd like to talk a little about medical writing, the actual use of English itself. I'd like you to read this abstract. It comes from a journal, a social science journal. Just look at the actual language used. Now I'd like you to read this introduction. Believe it or not, it's from the same article in the same journal. I'm sure by the end of reading these two pieces of prose that you can see that the second one is much easier to understand. Don't forget that the whole purpose of writing and publishing is to communicate ideas. The editor is there to help you communicate your ideas and will give you some tips on how to do it better. But when you're writing, it's not trying to fool the reader with your high-powered language. It's trying to communicate ideas. So the clearer your English, the more easily you'll be able to communicate your ideas. You can see that the second piece of prose really is aiming to write for clarity. There's some sense in the medical world that you have to write with scientific writing with big words and long sentences. In fact, that's not true. You can see for yourselves that writing with shorter sentences, simpler words, concrete words, communicates ideas much more clearly. Also, avoid jargon as much as possible. Of course, in any scientific area, there's going to be some jargon. Be sure in your journal article to always spell it out before you use it, short forms and so on. Use simple and familiar words, concrete words like men look like apples, women look like pears. That immediately gives you the image that you need. Keep sentences short to 15 to 20 words, and make sure the subject starts at the beginning and the predicate is at the end. Sentences that are inverted means that the reader has to carry ideas to the end of the sentence before they can understand it. Keep paragraphs short, 5 or 6 sentences maximum. And in fact, I like to break up big chunks of prose with lots of small paragraphs. It's much easier on the eye to read and helps the ideas to flow more smoothly. Avoid unnecessary or meaningless phrases like "it is the case that," etc. If you can, use the active voice as a group. For instance, doing research, you can say, "we did this, we did that." Some journals will require you to flip to the third person passive voice, but the active voice is much more engaging for the reader. I hate those particular kind of words that use like facilitation, collaboration, consultation. They're sometimes appropriate, but in many cases they just sound like big fancy words that don't really mean much. Also, be careful with the words of emphasis. You can only use most a few times. I always have an expression that less is more, and at the end of your writing session, go back through the article and check for tense. You'll be very surprised at how often you flip from present to past tense. My feeling is that the article took place in the past and everything should stay in the past, unless of course you're describing a program that is ongoing. In the program in Microsoft Word, you can look to see whether the spelling and grammar is fairly readable. There's a section under Tools that gives you the readability index, if you want to be bothered with that. Don't forget that the whole purpose of writing is to communicate ideas. Do it as clearly as possible. Use language that communicates ideas well.